Good evening. Welcome to this meeting of the Merrimack School Board this Monday evening, March 21st, 2016. Would you rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. That will take us to item number 2, approval of the March 7th, 2016 minutes. Is there a motion made by Mr. Powell, seconded by Vice Chair Barnes? Any corrections? Mr. Powell.
On page 2, top of the page, line 50, I would just like the paragraph to be changed somewhat to, as it reads right now, it leads me to believe that Athletic Director Sabian was at our meeting, and he was not. So I believe the superintendent brought his information to us, if I'm not, or the assistant superintendent. If you could just make that clarification, that would be great. And that's all I have.
Any other corrections? Ms. Guagliumi.
Just below that, there is a statement on line 53, page 2, line 53. Will be more flexibility with sports scheduled than last year. I'm wondering if that means like this year, the current year. That was one. And then the second one I had was on page 4, line number 170. And it was basically in reference to tomorrow, Tuesday, March 8, 2016, is the deliberative session. I thought we might want to clarify that with the school deliberative session, something like that. Those were the items I had.
Great. Any other corrections? I have a minor one in that same section on page 2, line 51. It's just grammatical. At the end of the sentence where it says calendar will be put Merrimack School District, if we can just strike the word be from that sentence. Okay, so with that, we'll put the minutes to a vote. All those in favor of approving the March 7th, 2016 minutes as amended, say aye. Opposed? None. The motion carries 5-0-0. And what is the student rep's opinion?
I'll abstain.
Okay, thank you, sir. And that will take us to item number 3, public participation. This is an opportunity for the public to address the board. All we ask is that you come to the microphone and state your name and address for the record. Good evening.
Hi, Tricia Swanger, 6 Clara Drive, short person. I just wanted to take the opportunity to fill you all in and anyone who's watching in on some of the good things that have been going on with the theater department at the high school as of late. So I don't know if anyone is aware on the board, but the Merrimack Educational Theater Group went and performed as part of the New Hampshire Educational Theater Guild Festival at Co-Brown a couple of weeks ago, and they had been chosen to move on to the state level festival. So that was quite an honor. They did a fantastic job. I saw the performance. It was wonderful. So they will be at the NHETG Festival April 1st and 2nd at Kingswood High School performing. And if you're interested in seeing them, come on down. There'll be 12 or 24 other schools performing as well. It's all one acts, and they're all adjudicated. So I just thought you'd want to be aware of that. And also, coming up after festival, the theater group is going to be putting on, I'm going to double check the dates, May 12th, 13th, and 14th, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, at the high school Little Theater. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware and hope to see you there.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Dunham. I live at 16 Wren Court, and I just wanted to give you another piece of nice news that sometimes that doesn't happen that often, that I was at the basketball game this weekend. For anyone who wasn't, you missed a doozy. And even though Merrimack didn't win some question about that, but apparently they didn't. And the grace of the team members and the audience was unbelievable. When people are running onto the court believing they've won and all of a sudden find out that that's not the case, to just go back and applaud for the players and to be silent. There was no booing, no negativity towards the other team. It was really impressive, and you should be very proud of them.
Thank you. And we are. Mr. Powell.
I know it's not normal, but if I can just add to that, I had a friend whose husband was officiating not that game, but the D2 game, the next period, and she said she made a comment to me rather that she was very impressed with how Merrimack held themselves given the whole situation. So I appreciate you for mentioning it, but it was noticed by the rest of the state as well.
That's wonderful. Great. Is there anyone else looking to address the board under public participation? If not, we will close public participation and move to item number 4, the consent agenda. Dr. Mark McLaughlin.
Thank you. On consent tonight is the retirement of Virginia Crook, social studies educator at Merrimack High School.
Thank you. Is there a motion made by Mr. Schneider? Or Mr. Schneider, you'd like to make a motion?
The reason I busted in is I wanted to move that we accept the consent agenda as read and to acknowledge that this is the last teacher that was at Merrimack High School when I attended Merrimack High School. And she started 2 years before I graduated. So most of us that graduated then knew her as Miss Corvo. That was her name, her maiden name back then. It's sad to see her go, but she's got a long and excellent career at Merrimack High School. So it's sad that I have to do this, but I think she's deserved everything.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Well said. Is there a second made by Mr. Powell? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, none. The motion carries 5-0-0. And actually, we generally don't take student reps' opinions on consent agenda. But if you have one, there you go. Yes. Thank you. I would just note Ms. Crook has taught in the Merrimack School District for 43 years, and so we thank her for her dedicated service to the district. That now takes us to item number 5 on the agenda, third review of proposed school calendar for 2016-2017. At our last meeting, we finalized and discussed and finalized the parent survey that would go out regarding the calendar. We got great feedback at this table, and that greatly enhanced the survey that went out. Historically, just as a benchmark for what we've done in the past, historically what we have done as a board is requested parental input. We've put notices on Power School and sent flyers home and asked them to email the board with their thoughts on the proposed calendar. Generally speaking, I think we've gotten about 30 to 50 responses per year on the survey. This year we decided as a board to put it out we decided to put it out as a Survey Monkey, and we used the school messenger system, the reverse 911 calling system, to let people know that it was available. And we received 940 responses, which is significant when you think about how much coverage that gives us for families in the district. So clearly, this was the way to go. What I'd like to do before we discuss the calendar is review the survey results on the handful of questions that we asked, so that folks have a sense of what others responded. So the first question was, do you support having no school on Columbus Day, October 10th, 2016? Yes was 56.38%. No was 43.62%. Question 2 was, do you support having no school on the day before Thanksgiving? Yes was 72.55%. No was 27.45%. Question 3 was, do you support extending the Christmas holiday vacation to include no school on Monday, January 2nd, 2017? No was 53.72%. Yes was 46.28%. Question 4 was, do you support having no school on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, January 16th, 2017? Yes was 50.32%. No was 49.68%. Question 5 was, do you support having no school on President's Day, February 20th, 2017, recognizing that the following week is February vacation? No was 75.43%. Yes was 24.57%. And then lastly, question 6 was, teacher workshops that are held as a cluster of days at the beginning of the school year would delay the start of school for students by up to 4 days. Could you support a school calendar that had such an impact on the start of school for students? Yes was 63.4%. No was 36.6%. And then, in addition to the 6 standard questions, we left a free-form text section for people to share their thoughts with us. More than half of the people who took the time to fill out the survey left a comment of some sort, and they were wide and varied as there were people, and in some cases they were brief, and in other cases quite long. I think as it relates to the survey, there were a lot of comments appreciating the opportunity to provide feedback, and there were a number of suggestions which I think the board may want to look at in future years in terms of extending the options for each of the questions. People felt yes and no were limiting, and that perhaps it's not important, or I don't have strong feelings one way or the other would have been an option that people would have liked. So before we talk about the calendar, does the board want to discuss the survey results? Mr. Powell.
Excuse me, I echo what you said at the onset as to the amount of feedback. The overwhelming response is very appreciative. How many families roughly do we have in the district? Is it about 1,400?
Yeah, it's more than that. Probably around unique families, probably in 2,000, 2,500. Yeah.
So this is still a significant response.
Statistically,
regardless.
It's terrific
I
as
mean,
far as the
obviously
response.
it's much more than the 30-some-odd that we would get by email, but for the first time out, I'm really impressed with the response that we got. And I'm assuming that we were able to somehow make it to where one family wasn't able to respond more than one time. Not that it would make a huge difference, but I don't know. The one, looking at the comments, just skimming through them, I didn't read all 500 and some odd of them. But the overwhelming theme that jumped out to me was looking at the combining of the March or the February and April vacations. I know it's something that we have discussed briefly at this level, and we've always kind of said, it's a Southeast, it's a Ceresc thing. We got to combine with other schools, and I hope every parent and public understands this, that it's not just Merrimack that would have to change. Because we have out-of-district placement for some of our students, they would be affected. So we'd have to look into some way to minimize that effect. But I think it is something that we should take from this and move forward in looking into it, just to see if it's possible.
Superintendent, sorry.
So I would say I agree that was something that kept popping up. And what I think we could ask is, for long-range planning, we ask the following question, because you couldn't do it the next year.
Exactly.
You'd have to do it like 2 years out or whatever. Timberlane Plastow thought that they were going to have a large hue and cry for it. It went through something like this. And when they actually put it forward, they did not get the buy-in. So that's why I think it's very important to ask and to say this is for long-range planning as compared to the next year.
Oh, absolutely, and certainly I'm not looking at it for. Obviously, we can't do it for 16, 17, and I'm not even thinking 17, 18. I'm thinking years out. But the groundwork has to be laid at some point to start the conversation, and that's what I would encourage us to start looking at instead of always saying, "Gee, it would be nice." Well, let's find out if it's possible. As you said, Timberlane thought it would be, and then found out that it wasn't such the big thing. Maybe that's what we'll find out, but we'll never know until we try.
Vice Chair Barnes.
And that being said, I did also notice that was the running theme, but I think what we have to also consider is that people wouldn't give feedback on something that's been in place and is not up for question. So it's something that I think we would need to poll the parents to say, of you Merrimack parents, who would be in favor of combining to a single week versus 2 weeks. Because it sounds as though from our feedback on prior years that they really are aligned. Parents look forward to their February Disney vacation half off because Massachusetts pays full price. But those kind of things actually matter, and they seem to have a regimented schedule of time off as a family. So that could be very impactful as well.
Ms. Guglielmi.
I had read all of the comments. I actually got through the first couple hundred trying to put them in buckets.
It's fun, isn't it?
Yeah, at least right in other. But I would say that was a theme, the combining of the breaks, as well as a lot of themes around extending the summer in general, whether it was starting after Labor Day or starting before Labor Day or ending earlier in June versus ending too late. There were a lot of them around that. A lot of thank you to the board. A lot of I like the calendar as it is. There were a lot of those kind of notes as well, and that kept repeating itself. A longer Christmas or holiday vacation, not as long of a holiday vacation. And then the comments that you would expect to see, some in favor of the Martin Luther King and President's Day, a little bit about election. But anyways, like I said, I got through a couple hundred of them. And there was the suggestion a couple times that you had mentioned, which was kind of a don't feel strongly or about the question that was being asked. Right. But I'm really glad that we did it. And I think that the response is great, and the positive response that we've received from the survey itself in the comments, as well as comments that I've received from other people personally, makes me really glad we did it. And I'd like to see us do more of this kind of survey around this or other topics. Not all the time, because if you don't want to over call and contact these people, but around items that are important where, to be able to have a mechanism that we can easily get out and inquire to parents or stakeholders or whatnot is, I think, really important. So I'm very excited about the results. I'm excited about the data, the yes and no. So I think that this is great. I'd like to see us do more of it.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider.
So I agree that the data was really good. I mean, the questions that we asked to gather the specific yes or no were good. It was interesting how close most of them were. There were a couple that were overwhelmed, that were significant in their preference, but a lot that were very, very close. One of the things that's interesting is, yes, the option, the concept of combining the vacations came up, but there were still a fair amount that said, matter of fact, if you read through, you'll find you should get rid of one of the vacations, and the next comment is, say, please keep them the way that they are. And I think you're absolutely right that people will take whatever their sensitive spot and put it into their one comment that it can do it. I would like to see us, to echo what Cinda said, I'd like to see us use this in a proactive way for calendar planning. I'd like to see us do it not when we're getting ready to put the calendar out. So like if we started in at the beginning of the fall, start thinking about the calendar for a year and a half out, decide sort of what questions we'd like to ask for planning purposes to get to the superintendent's point. But take some of the trends here and be able to ask some of the additional questions to help us to dig a little bit deeper into this, because we did talk at the last meeting about teachable hours versus days and the pros and cons with that, and how we've chose not at this point to go there, but we need to take some steps to look a little deeper to see if it makes sense, but also about the vacations and some of the other stuff. So certainly you're right. You don't want to have too many surveys, but there are ways I think we could use this to get some more not actionable data, but at least more trending data that's more accurate, a little more evenly asked. So.
Ms. Guglielmi.
I agree with Andy in the approach of earlier is better, and I think that being able to plan a couple of topics, not that we can get data on and use, that we intend to use around some important issues, or whether it's the top 3 items that we want to pull the community on or whatever, I think is important, and then put them all together from a strategic perspective.
That's a great idea. Mr. Marcus.
I also appreciated the survey largely because it makes the calendar process seem a lot less arbitrary, because you can see, I know I am personally in favor of taking January 2nd off. I like Martin Luther King Day. I'm a fan of holidays. But when you see the parent response to the surveys, and you can see that there's a clear majority who are in favor or not in favor of this, I think that seeing it as a survey and not as a decision of the superintendent's office was definitely helpful. And then beyond that, just to address some of the comments that Mr. Powell brought up, or I think it was Mr. Powell, you or Mr. Schneider, but I'm sure that there aren't a whole lot of students that left comments if they even took the survey, but a lot of the parents that I saw said things along the lines of, I don't see the point of having the February break and the March break, but I just wanted to say that as a student, not only are they nice to have split up because it makes winter months easier to get through, kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't mean to say that as if school is a grueling process that you have to drag yourself out of bed for every day, but it's still nice to have that light at the end of the tunnel. And as a senior, it's also very helpful for college visits, because having those broken up gives us more opportunity to visit schools while missing minimal class time, because you don't begin to hear back from schools until February, March, and April.
Wonderful. Thank you for that perspective. I agree with all the comments that were shared at the table, and I'm very pleased to have that we were able to put out a survey to get the response rate that we did in order to make a data-based decision. So often at this table, we've had discussions, in particular one of the questions, this whole concept of whether to take the Wednesday before Thanksgiving off has been a hot topic at this table, And some people have felt that perhaps we weren't listening to parents and were more concerned about the teacher survey that supported having that Wednesday off. But putting the question out there, it was the one actually with the highest divergence in responses, overwhelmingly, close to 73% of the parents who responded like having that day off. That's a piece of data we never had before, and so this is hugely, hugely informative to the process of deciding the calendar. Yes, Ms. Guagliumi.
I know that you read the results, but can we put the responses to these questions on the website so people visually can take a look at the bar
I think
graphs
that's a
and
great
whatnot?
idea.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
So with that, we have the proposed calendar. This is our third review of the calendar. I think at this point, we probably ought to move the calendar. So what I would do is open it up if there are any motions in terms of amending the calendar or moving the calendar. First, I'll open it up to amendment motions. Are there any? Ms. Guagliumi.
I just wanted to say the calendar as it stands in its draft mode
Yep.
is reflective and matches the
questions that were
questions and the parents' responses. So I don't want to make any motions to change it because we have requested that feedback, and the feedback supports the calendar as it stands right now.
Okay. Mr. Schneider.
Yeah, and what surprised me was the number of people that did not want to extend. I mean, it wasn't a significant majority, but it was a majority that did not want to add January 2nd, even though it's a national holiday, for the 1st of January to it. So that was, to me, that was a good piece of data to get as part of this. So,
Mr. Powell.
Well, I'll just jump in. I move that we accept the calendar as submitted.
Second, so moved by Mr. Powell, seconded by Vice Chair Barnes. Discussion, Mr. Powell?
I concur with what Mr. Schneider said regarding and Ms. Guagliumi, that the calendar reflects exactly what we asked for. We asked for feedback. We got the feedback. It's almost spot on. The only days that I was even questioning were January 2nd, maybe doing a swap with that and Martin Luther King Jr. Day. However, there doesn't seem to be a groundswell for that, so I'm content with leaving it as presented.
Okay. Further discussion by the board? Seeing none, we'll put the motion to a vote. All those in favor of accepting or moving the school calendar as presented signify by saying aye. Opposed, none. The motion carries 5-0-0, and the student rep's opinion.
In favor.
Thank you. And that will now take us to something I'm very much looking forward to. Item number 6, United States Senate Youth Program. And I will turn this over to our esteemed student representative who spent a week in Washington, D.C. To share his experience with us.
I have a slideshow, which is as much.
Could you check the mic?
Yeah, it's green. Is the mic? Does it sound like it now? Okay.
A little bit.
But I have a slideshow, which is
We're just waiting for the projector to come up. Okay. And Justin, can
Is this one better? Is this one good? This mic? Yeah, My name's Jacob Marcus. Is this good? All right. So as this loads, I can, again, a couple meetings ago, Mr. Ortega provided an adequate summary of what the week would be, but considering the best he could do without having gone or known anyone that went, because I know that prior to last week, I would have called it an excellent summary, but now that I have had the pleasure of experiencing it, I'm sorry, Mr.
Just
Ortega.
keep going, Mr.
All right.
Marcus. I'm not offended in the least. They're having fun at my expense. Keep going.
I was trying to make a point that I wasn't expecting it to be as incredible a week as it was. So a brief comment couldn't do it justice, and that's why I'm happy that the superintendent put this slot in the agenda so that I could go into greater detail with you. So I have this slideshow, which is admittedly as much for your benefit as it is to help me remember everything we did, because we did a lot, and the pictures are in chronological order of the week. You see I'm up there, second row, fifth from the left. That's me. But this is the official portrait. You can see it says the Hearst Foundations, which sponsored it. That's William Randolph Hearst's family. They're, since the very first year, 54 years ago, they have funded it entirely, and I want to express my deepest appreciation and gratitude to the Hearst Foundations, because the week was very incredible and evidently very expensive. That became apparent the very first day we were there. But to explain it a little bit, 104 delegates are chosen from across the country. It's 2 from each state, 2 from Washington, D.C., and then 2 from the DODEA, which is Department of Defense Educational Activity. So the 2 delegates there, one lived on an Army base in South Korea, another on an Air Force base in Okinawa, Japan. And we were put up in the Mayflower Hotel for a week in Washington, D.C., which is one of the oldest hotels in the city. And I wasn't expecting it to be as nice as it was, but that same week, Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, was here to meet with President Obama, and that was the hotel he was staying in. So for those 3 nights, there was heightened security for us. They didn't want us wandering about the hotel, but it was, so again, I just want to thank the Hearst Foundations. But when we got there, we also worked with 17 military mentors who are officers in all 5 branches of the military who apply for the program like we do. And I guess to best sum up what they do, I would say chaperones, but they're a lot more than chaperones. They were mentors. They helped us get place to place on time. They made sure we were asleep at the right time, because it was a very tiring week, and if left to our own devices, we probably wouldn't have had the energy to get through it. But this is my mentor group. For the most part, we weren't put with people from our state. If you see on the left, that's Captain Deerling. He is a captain in the Marine Corps, and he was the one that helped us for the week. On the first day, they had an easy day where we got to go to Mount Vernon. That's George Washington's home, and this was the best picture of it. And it seemed almost small by today's comparisons, but they had put it in Washington's, that is, his slave quarters were larger than most homes in Virginia at the time. So it was essentially a colonial palace, and we learned a lot about Washington. It was inspiring because you get to hear it from people who have devoted their lives to telling Washington's story, and to hear them speak about it was more moving than, say, a unit on the Revolution in your 8th grade history class. So they spoke a lot about how he turned down power. He's frequently likened to Cincinnatus, the Roman dictator who then resigned from being dictator because he didn't want the power. He went back to farming, and a lot of that, even George Washington played up that image, and he has a painting in his house that's called George Washington as Cincinnatus. After that, we went to the Newseum, It's like museum and news. It's funny. But we heard from Jeffrey Herbst, who's the president of the museum. He had a PhD in something communications related, but he was a specialist not only in global communications, but he also worked in budding democracies in sub-Saharan Africa. And his perspective was extremely interesting. He was evidently brilliant. He was a really smart guy. But he talked to us mostly about media and its effect in politics. And one of his larger issues was that of algorithms. So if you look at Google News or Facebook, which look at what you read and then spit out articles that they think you'll want to read. So we managed to put ourselves in, as he called it, a filter bubble, where unless we are conscientious consumers of the news, then we only read what we want to read. So someone who's liberal, and they can tell from their Facebook posts, they'll be inundated with Huffington Post. Facebook will never show them Fox News. And because of that, we have the unfortunate, and the same thing goes for conservatives, they will never see Huffington Post recommended by Facebook. And because of that, we have developed a political culture where we don't try to agree with the other side. He talked about how he believes that attitudes in the comments section spill out into our national discourse, which is evident in the 2016 cycle for sure. And it was very insightful. However, he did, while he talked about many of the negative effects we've been seeing in politics, someone had quoted Anderson Cooper's reflection that this election is, quote, an indictment of democracy. And he ultimately said that candidates like Donald Trump, I'm trying not to get too political, but it was a very political week. But candidates like Donald Trump that many might see as an indictment to democracy are actually a reflection of what the American people want. So he said he is not so quick to denounce someone as not the right candidate, because the right candidate is whoever the American people support. And then we heard from Chief Judge Henry of the 10th Circuit. He's now the president of the Oklahoma City University, I believe. I didn't write that down. It's somewhere here. But this was the day we went to the Supreme Court. So he talked mostly about judicial philosophies, that of textualism, which is Scalia's, and Justice Scalia, that is. And he disagreed with that strongly. And then that of activism and a broad interpretation, which Justice Ginsburg is in favor of, and he talked about the effects that those had on the legal system. Later in the week, when we had a delegate dance, he came in and danced with us. He was also a U.S. Senate Youth alumnus, so he reflected on his time in the program, and he definitely came very far after hearing from it. Then we went to the Kennedy Caucus Room at the Russell Senate offices, where we heard from Julie Adams, who was the Secretary of the Senate, and Elizabeth McDonough, who's the parliamentarian. The Secretary is essentially in charge of everything the Senate, all of its internal operations, so she has to make sure offices have paper and Wi-Fi and everything. She does all of that. Whereas the parliamentarian, her office is essentially the Senate law firm, where any matters of legality go to her office. Every bill, she reads every introduced bill, or her office, that is, reads every introduced bill and then decides which committee it goes to. So she's the one that ultimately makes the decision to see whether it's a health committee issue or a veterans committee issue. They are staff, yes. They are confirmed by the Senate. So they are appointed and then confirmed. So Julie Adams, she worked in Mitch McConnell's office as a staffer, and then he appointed her to be secretary, and the Senate votes on her confirmation. So it's similar to judges and cabinet members, but the majority leader nominates rather than the president. And Ms. Adams offered us the advice, remain humble, have a strong work ethic, and be a team player. And she acknowledged the fact that that seems very trite and not something you would expect to hear. She had said if we were expecting to hear loftier advice, it doesn't get loftier than that. And she said even in the world of politics, which people often like to see as a more House of Cards-esque, dark world, which isn't to say that there aren't any similarities. She said that ultimately it's those virtues that allow you to succeed in Washington. She also described D.C. as a really small, big city. So she said you always have to be conscious of how you treat someone because it will either come back to help you or bite you in the butt. And then Elizabeth McDonough reflected on the challenges faced by women in the Senate because someone had asked if she felt the pressures of being a woman in an obviously male-dominated world, and she responded flat out with yes. And then she talked about the importance of women mentoring women in the Senate, and this was later something that was reiterated by Justice Ginsburg and then Senators Shaheen and Ayotte. When we met with them, they all spoke of the importance of women sticking together. And then she also said government is a living, breathing entity, and she said that ultimately the people are as important, if not more important, than the policy, and it's important to always interact with people and not to just speak through. She discussed portals where you can talk to the C-SPAN camera rather than there it goes. Talk to the C-SPAN camera rather than the senators around you. And then we met with Betty Coate, who's the historian of the Senate, and she offered a couple. Profiles of Courage was John F. Kennedy's book, and she did something similar where she spoke about two senators and discussed their leadership. She also talked about the way leadership has evolved, where the positions of majority and minority leader and whip are relatively new in our history. Before, it used to be just the most powerful, or not the most powerful, but the natural leaders. They would step up and assume the mantle of leadership rather than be elected, or they were elected, but rather be further elected in a senatorial caucus to that leadership. So one such person she talked about was Daniel Webster of New Hampshire, who held no office in the Senate. He was just a senator like anyone else, but his indomitable personality and evident brilliance allowed him to be remembered as one of the most impactful senators in American history. And then she also talked about the evolution of political parties and how it used to be, and she thinks it's ultimately for the worse, I believe. We used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. And when I say that, I don't mean moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. There were the Southern Democrats who were against civil rights legislation, and then there were the Northern Republicans who were fiercely pro-civil rights legislation. There were many Northern Democrats that were against welfare reform. And she said that that use of faction rather than just a two-party system allowed us to do a lot of great work, especially under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. That was one of the highlights of that period of the Northern and Southern Republican and Democrat two-axis spectrum. And then we went to the Supreme Court that same day, where we got to hear from Justice Ginsburg, which was definitely one of the highlights of the week. Justice Ginsburg was extremely interesting just to hear from, but then she was also inspiring. She spoke about how important she thought personal connection was. She gave us a brief history of the first 8 chief justices of the Supreme Court, and apparently when John Marshall was Chief Justice, he established judicial review and made the court the constitutional power that it is. Before, it wasn't very important. But apparently back then, the justices lived in a dormitory together, and as a result of that, they had to be friends, and they had to talk about all of their issues, which is not something you have to do now. And because of that, you saw many fewer, I don't know how to phrase that grammatically, but you saw a lot less dissents. And those dissents that there were, they were far less scathing than they are now. And she thinks that's because there was a greater amount of friendship and respect between the justices. And now there is a tradition where whenever they go to discuss the issues, when they walk into the room, the justices, that is, when they walk into the room together, they all give each justice a handshake, and she thinks that's her favorite, or not she thinks, she says that's her favorite tradition in the court because it is although not quite as uniting as all having to live in the same building, she thinks that it keeps them personally connected rather than just competing legal minds. And on that, in a similar thread, she talked about her relationship with the late Justice Scalia, whom, as most of you probably know, they could not have been in greater disagreement, but they were also the closest friends on the court. They vacationed together. There was an opera called Scalia and Ginsburg, which she actually promoted in her speech. It'll be playing in New York next summer. But she said that even though she disagreed with him on just about every issue, like there are very few that they were in agreement on, then she still respected him as a person, and because of that, she thinks that all of their discussions were elevated to a greater level. And, of course, it wouldn't be a conversation with Justice Ginsburg without talking about women's issues. And she said, "The change is exhilarating." Those were her words for women. But then there's still a long way to go. And she spent quite a bit of time talking about the Ledbetter case, where the court held that wage discrimination is constitutional until Congress passes a constitutional law to ban it. And she said that was her proudest and most scathing dissent, because she believes that that was among the worst decisions of the court, which she believes the worst decision was the Dred Scott case, where the Chief Justice held that slaves would never be free people and didn't have the right to sue in court. She thinks that's the worst decision the court has ever come to. And I believe that that is one of the things that she and Scalia would agree on. That night, we had the privilege of hearing from the Fife and Bugle Corps of the United States military, and that's a picture of them playing, which, for the record, all of these photos, I didn't take these, but they were done by Jakob Moser, who was actually a graduate of one of the Hearst programs on journalism. He was in the photojournalism entry. He ended up beating his wife. His current wife. She was the runner-up, and they ended up getting married. But so these are all his photos. Jakob Moser. And that's spelled like Jacob with a K, but Jakob. And that was really cool. I wanted to throw in the picture because it's not all policy addresses. As you saw, we got to do the touristy stuff, and then this was really cool. This is a picture of the food. The food there was incredible. Like, I think I really peaked at 17. Like, I don't think I'm going to have food that was that good again in my life. But then we heard from Cory Gardner, who was one of this year's Senate co-chairs of the committee, and he is also a Senate Youth alum. And he spoke to us about not only how his experience in the Senate Youth program shaped his interest in politics and his knowing not only what he wanted to do, but why he wanted to do it and how he was planning on doing it. He also talked about, on a more political note, the importance of common sense leadership. He's a moderate Republican, so everyone agreed with what he was saying because he spoke about common sense leadership, and he believes that those are the issues that everyone can get behind, and I agree because I am not a Republican, and I agreed with him on just about every issue he talked about. And then he discussed the importance of young people, and that after a metaphor with his kid who said the thing he was most excited for about turning 5 years old was his ability to lift big rocks, and he tied that into the need for America has to lift the big rocks, and we have to always overcome the challenges that especially my generation will face. And he was definitely one of the cooler speakers because he knew what it was like to be in our shoes. He made sure to stay. He hung around for like 45 minutes afterwards so he could sign all of our books and talk to all of us, or talk to many of us individually. And then we got to tour the Goddard Space Flight Center and hear from several representatives of NASA, including Dr. Piers Sellers, who was an astronaut, and now he works with satellites. And this machine you see in the background, this simulates outer space. So it reduces the temperature to 5 degrees Kelvin, which is I think, negative 268 degrees Celsius. I'm pretty sure that's right. And then it takes, I don't remember the pressure, but it simulates a vacuum of space. And we also got to see, if you look at the poster out in the back above where we're standing, it's the James Webb Space Telescope, which will be launched soon, and it's going to replace the Hubble Space Telescope. And it was very cool because they finished the mirrors the day before we got there, so we got to see the mirrors. They haven't built the heat plates yet, but we got to see the mirrors, which are powerful enough to see 13.5 light years away, and as such, 13.5 billion light years, excuse me, much bigger. And then as such, it can see 13.5 billion years into the past because of the way light travels, and that'll allow them to see the very first formations in our universe and understand where everything came from. And that is due to launch, I believe, in early 2018, so we're almost there. And then these were another two devices that they showed us. The arm closest to us is designed to refuel satellites that are not designed to be refueled, because as it stands, we have 1,000 satellites orbiting Earth, and once one runs out of fuel or breaks, we just leave it up there and replace it with a new one. So they're looking for ways to not have to do that every time because it's expensive, yes. And then the arm you see in the background, the little gold thing close to that asteroid, is part of a robot that they're almost finished building, which goes out and grabs asteroids and pulls them into Earth's parking orbit. So then we can send manned missions up to take samples of the asteroids and potentially in the future mine minerals from them. And I asked if there was a way to get the asteroid out of Earth's parking orbit, and they said they haven't figured that out yet, but considering it'll stay there safely for 200 years, they're comfortable kicking the can down the road a little bit. They figured in 200 years someone will find a solution, and if they haven't, then we probably have bigger problems than an asteroid falling. And then we got to go to the White House and hear from President Obama, which I believe was the highlight of the week. It's hard to top the President of the United States. And he spoke about, among other things, his was one of the most political speeches. It was very political in the beginning and then not as political at the end. It became more general, but he really came out swinging against Congress right away. And then after that, he talked about the importance of, his quote was, don't think about what you want to be, think about what you want to do. And he emphasized the importance of not pursuing any office, but rather thinking about how you want to help people and in what capacity, and jumping on whichever opportunity presents itself. Because as you probably know, he lost 3 national elections, I think, and then ran for senator and then for president right after that. And he said he never intended to be president, and even when he thought about it after becoming senator, he didn't expect to this young, but he saw the opportunity and he wanted to help people, and then it came to be. And if you notice on the little lamppost, there's a Canadian flag because that was the day Trudeau was in town, so they had Canadian flags next to the United States and District of Columbia flag everywhere. The president also emphasized the need for bipartisanship, but then discouraged bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake. He said that you have to remain committed to your principles and pursue meaningful change rather than pursue something you don't believe in simply because it gives you bipartisan credibility in the news. And he seemed very pensive the whole time he spoke, but it was definitely the most insightful conversation. And here's some more food. The food was very good. Like, I can't stress that enough. And this was a passion fruit tart and then a chicken over rice. And then this was our meeting with Mazie Hirono. We got to eat dinner in the National Archives. So just to the right of where the senator is standing, that's Mazie Hirono, the senator from Hawaii. And just to the right of where the senator is standing is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. And Senator Hirono had her speech was focused primarily on her story as an immigrant from Japan, as well as a woman, and how she is one of the marginalized groups in the country, and fortunately found herself in a position where she can fight for other marginalized groups. And her speech was very inspiring because it focused on public service, not as a career, but as a public service. And she said that those in power need to fight for those who do not have power. And then, the next morning, we were supposed to hear from Chris Matthews, but he had to cancel because the elections were heating up. So he recommended Jonathan Capehart, who is a Washington Post contributor, and he's also on MSNBC a lot. He's on Chris Matthews' show, which is why he recommended him as a contributor. And this was one of our farther to the left breakfast guests. And his speech was really interesting because everyone there, all of the delegates, that is, were very interested in politics. And he's in the business of politics. He analyzes the races. He looks at how what the candidates say affects the voters and affects their polling. He talked a lot about polling, so it was definitely insightful in a different way. His speech, I wouldn't say it was inspiring the way President Obama's was, but his was more academic and it was more political science oriented, so it was still one of the more interesting speeches of the week. He talked about the role of media in the election, which the 24 hours news cycle was mentioned by just about everyone who spoke to us, and none of them like it very much, even the media representative. But he had a different perspective, where as a journalist, he believes it is his duty to report on everything that happens. And as such, even when we think... So we talked about Donald Trump a lot when we were talking to him, and he had said a lot of people criticize the media for giving Trump the kind of attention that he gets, which many people think it may make America look bad on the global stage. Other people think it's unfairly helping one candidate in a primary because they don't cover other issues. I asked him about Marco Rubio had made a comment that said after one of the lowest weeks with regard to substantial debate in the primaries, Rubio had made a comment that said they don't cover me when I talk about health care reform. They only cover me when I insult Donald Trump. And Mr. Capehart had said that that's true, and it's an unfortunate reality, but the media can't decide what it should report on. They have to report on everything, because as soon as we decide this isn't becoming of the race for the presidency, then we're censoring the news, and he has fundamental objections to that concept. So it was another interesting take on things. Yeah, and then this was the Alexander House, where we got to hear from Jack Warren, I wrote down that he was the president, but I believe he's the CEO of the Society of Cincinnati, which is the oldest patriotic organization in the country. Its first president was George Washington. Its second president was Alexander Hamilton. And the director, thank you, Mr. Schneider. It says on your brochure. Oh, it does? Thank you. So the director of the Society of Cincinnati. And his speech was the opposite of Mr. Capehart's, I would say, where it was not policy or politics oriented at all, but spoke about the importance of the American Revolution and how it began the end to the era of slavery. And he said it's not perfect. There was still slavery in the Constitution, but it created the first republic that could exist without one form of oppression or another, it was completely unheard of in American history. And he spoke about its importance, and it was very inspiring to hear, because he was very committed to it. He's studied the revolution his entire life, and now he's involved with the Society of Cincinnati. And it was an interesting speech because he offered a perspective that a lot of people don't take anymore, because he made the observation that we're very removed from the American Revolution, it's a thing of history. But if you focus on what it was like before and what it was like after, that was one of the greatest moments in human history, certainly in modern Western history. In that same room, after lunch, we heard from Ambassador Peter Wittig of Germany, and that was another very interesting speech because he spoke. I've said every speech, I say, that's another interesting speech. They were all interesting. They were all, everyone who got to speak to, everyone whom we got to speak with, I should say, they were all very, very smart people and very interesting. So Ambassador Wittig had emphasized, he talked about the partnership between the United States and Germany, as we had expected from the ambassador, but he talked about he emphasized the importance of that partnership in many different areas. He talked about how we have many things to learn from each other. So, for example, he cited America's collegiate system, which is the best in the world, and then Germany's vocational schooling system, which is one of the best in the world with regards to the vocation. And he said if we can draw on each other's ideas in that one area and many, many others, we can have a positive impact not only on our countries, but the world and the stability of the world. He also talked, there it goes again. He also talked about the importance of coalitions. As you can imagine, Germany is as immersed as we are in the crisis in Syria, considering they've accepted, I think it's 10,000 refugees from Syria. And then they're also as deeply involved with Russia as we are, if not more so, because Angela Merkel ended up being the primary communicator for all of the European Union with President Putin. And his was insightful because he was able to look at America as an outsider, as someone who was representing another country rather than a part of ours. And he did express some frustrations with the American system because he has to deal with an executive that says one thing and a Congress that says another. And he talked about some of the frustrations there, but he said ultimately the ties between Germany and the United States are in the greatest condition they ever have been, and he is excited to see what the future holds for the two countries. And then this is me and the other delegate from New Hampshire, Dodi Eid, and that's us meeting with Senator Ayotte and then Senator Shaheen. And that was definitely one of the coolest parts of the week because we got to see our own senators in the flesh and actually talk with them. And what shocked me most is, because we got the most personal interaction with them than anyone else, was how human they seem. And obviously I know that they're normal people, but then I talked to Kelly Ayotte about her commute because she flies down Sunday nights to Washington, D.C., and then flies back home Thursdays because she lives in New Hampshire. And we talked about her commute, and she and Dodi talked. They're both from Nashua. She went to Nashua High before there was a North and a South. And she seemed very ordinary. And Dodi talked about how he's interning for her campaign over the summer. And then she asked if I've worked on political campaigns, and I said I've worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign, so wasn't going to intern for hers over the summer. But even she had said we obviously disagree on many political issues, but then she talked about everything New Hampshire has done for her and how someone who's from New Hampshire and committed to the state regardless of their political beliefs, they can get along because they have the same goal in mind, just different means of getting there. And she did advise both of us, stay in New Hampshire. That was one of her greatest words of wisdom. And Senator Shaheen, we talked about her. She's passing I say passing because it has bipartisan support in both houses of Congress, but it's a bill that would work to tackle the heroin epidemic in the Northeast, and it allocates more funds to the DEA and many other things that I can't remember off the top of my head. It's a very long bill, but we talked about that and how she thinks it's one of the most important things a senator from New Hampshire can be doing right now, and she and Ayotte have both support that bill, and they've been pushing it in their respective parties together. And then she also told us a story about how every month, every woman in the Senate gets together and eats dinner, Republican and Democrat, and that tied in with the parliamentarians' comments about how important it is for women to mentor women. And I'm sure that would be more inspiring if I was a woman, but I can still appreciate it. And then we heard from Ernest Moniz, who's the Secretary of Energy. Prior to this trip, I just knew him as the guy with the funny hair. And he was definitely a policy wonk. He talked about the role of the Department of Energy, and he categorized it as weapons, windmills, quarks, and quagmires, because they deal with all of our nuclear arsenals almost to an equal degree, if not a greater one, than the Department of Defense. Windmills, they invest in, I shouldn't say invest, they are the leaders in developing new sustainable forms of energy, such as windmills. Quarks, because the Department of Energy is the single largest funder of physics research in the country, and quagmires, because they're often pulled in for nuclear, I don't want to say disasters, because if it were really a disaster, we would know about them, and he would probably be way too busy to speak to us, but any major issues with nuclear technology or other technologies. And he emphasized that the government is hugely important in funding science, and he had hoped that, obviously he works in a Democratic administration, but he had emphasized his hope that people on both sides of the aisle can recognize that not only is it a huge funder of jobs, but we have never seen an era in scientific research as we have now, where we have the resources of all of the United States of America working to push the frontiers of our knowledge and understanding of the world. And in the process, we can make the world a better place through both government initiatives and partnerships with the private sector. He also talked about helping Africa invest in infrastructure. And then we heard, on another science theme, Charles Bolden, the administrator of NASA, and he touched on a lot of similar concepts. Someone had asked why we should fund NASA, like why is it necessary, and he again emphasized the fact that it's the United States government is one of the largest funders of science, and it's in our DNA to explore and to learn new things, and he thinks that that should always be an utmost priority, and the reason it's not talked about in elections is because just about everyone in elected office, Republican and Democrat, agree with him, and that's why it never comes up in debates, because everyone likes NASA. And then we also talked about Mars, because as you've probably heard, the Obama administration is hoping to start us on a path where we can reach Mars and reach humans on Mars, that is. We've already had drones. But get humans on Mars by the 2030s. And we talked about the progress that's being made there, and he said one of the coolest quotes of the week, if not the most politically relevant, we are the generation of Mars. Because he said he was the generation of the moon, and we are the generation of Mars. And that was very cool. And I won't go to that picture yet. I didn't have a picture of Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee. And he's on the Health Committee, which is Health, Science, and Education. And he talked about, I'm sure that you as a local school board would appreciate this. He said no one in Washington, D.C. can promise you good schools or good teachers. So he is a strong proponent of devolving power to local school boards and state governments. And then he also talked about the need in elections to emphasize the good over the bad. And he told stories about what he thinks makes America great, and talked about the fact that no candidate right now is talking about why we're one of, if not the greatest country in the world, but rather what's wrong with America and what's wrong with the other people running for president. And he said that when someone finally figures out that it's just as important to talk about what's good then they will surely be the next president of the United States. And then he talked to us about leadership and how it's always important to make decisions based on what's right, not on what is politically convenient or easy. And then we met with Brian Lamb, which is up here. He's the founder of C-SPAN. And we didn't meet with him the way we did others, but rather we did a C-SPAN special where he interviewed all of us for an hour. I was not interviewed. He never called on me. But we got to talk about our experience here. He's talking to Captain Long. I remember her last name was Long, but I can't remember her position. She's in the United States Air Force, and she was one of our military mentors. Major Long, thank you. And we didn't get to speak to him much, but it's always nice to be on C-SPAN. And that's going to air in April, so set your DVRs. And then that day we also heard from a soldier who is part of the honor guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And he spoke about not only the commitment that goes into that regiment, but also why they do it. And he spoke about how it's important that they strive for perfection for those soldiers that can't be honored. And they can't be honored because they're unknown, not that we aren't honoring them. And he talked about the fact that it's not a show, but it's one of the deepest expressions of respect that they can create. A fun fact, they have to spend 6 to 8 hours shining their shoes every day because they have leather shoes and they need to make them look like the shoes that everyone else wears. And you can be removed from the guard if you get a major gaffe. It's called a major gaffe is anything that someone from the crowd can notice, such as licking your lips or twitching your hand. And then a minor gaffe is something that observers won't notice, such as having your gun at the wrong angle or taking slightly too large of a step. And for these small infractions, you can be removed from the honor guard. Their uniforms have to be perfect within 1/64th of an inch, and if it's off by anything more than that, then that's a minor gaffe. If you have 2 minor gaffes, you are removed, I believe. I didn't write the exact rules down, but I'm pretty sure that's what sticks in my mind. And then that day, we got to hear from John Kirby, who is the Deputy Secretary of State for Public Affairs. We were actually 2 hours from hearing from John Kerry. As you see in the schedule, it says John Kirby, but Secretary Kerry's schedule is the hardest to coordinate, even harder than the president's. So they had tried to I don't want to say set the bar low, because he's the Deputy Secretary of State, but set the bar slightly lower. And then Friday morning, though, after 4 days of Secretary Kerry, his schedule being all right, and he would still be able to meet with us, they leaked it so that we could revise any questions we might want to ask. And then 2 hours before we got to the State Department, he had to fly to Saudi Arabia. So we still got to meet with the Deputy Secretary of State, so I'm certainly not complaining. But he talked a lot. His was definitely a more policy-oriented speech. He focused on the United States' leadership role in the world, and then gave us a lot of time to ask him about certain issues like the Syrian civil war, the Iran nuclear deal, Russia in general. And it was very interesting because right after us, he went to speak to the press corps. So he treated us more like reporters than students, and he was very upfront with us about the issues. And it was because those are some of the most controversial issues we're facing in this election. So to be able to speak to someone in a position of real influence and have him answer policy questions was definitely an insight. And that's the end of the slideshow. We went home to the hotel that night, had our final dinner, and then dancing and refreshments, and didn't sleep that night because that lasted until midnight, and then my coach left for the airport at 3:30 a.m. So Yeah, it was tough to stay awake, but I figured I'd make those last 3.5 hours, and then I flew home. I slept the whole way. I barely woke up to get off of the one plane because we changed in Philadelphia. So I was barely awake to get off the one plane and onto the other, but we got home, and I can say that this was probably the greatest week of my life, and I expect that it'll remain up there for a long time. So I guess-
Wonderful. Well, I think on behalf of the board, we're pleased to hear that you had the best week of your life down there. I think from our perspective, we are extremely proud and couldn't pick a better representative for New Hampshire and in particular Merrimack to go to the program and represent us. So we're very glad that you went.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, that was a lot longer than I was expecting it to be, but
It was
So-
comprehensive, and I enjoyed it. I'm glad you had a good time. So why don't we move forward then in the agenda? Thank you, Mr. Marcus. And we'll move to item number 7, development of a charge for the Planning and Building Committee. And actually, I'd actually like for us to discuss 2 potential charges. The first is one that we've talked about, which is the property on O'Gara Drive. The lease with the town will expire in July of 2018. The property currently houses the basketball courts will be going away. The town will be returning that to green space based on. What did I say?
Basketball.
I'm sorry. Tennis courts. Tennis courts. Yeah, sorry. The tennis courts will be returned to green space. The property still houses basketball courts, skate park, the ice rink, and there was a question at our last joint meeting about what do we want to do with the property, and would we consider extending that, et cetera. That said, I think that there's an opportunity for the Planning and Building Committee to look at the space, look at the needs of the district, and gather some requirements internally within the district for what we might want to use that space for. I'm using the royal we here, but I'm thinking specifically the Mastrocola complex, the high school. There's a 3-acre property there that, if we were to put an open question to them to say, what might you use this space for, it might be an interesting question. Additionally, Board Member Schneider had raised the concept of the central office, SAU, the consolidated building, which is currently slated to go on that property back behind Brentwood at the back end of the high school parking lot. Whether this property would be suitable, feasible at all for that use. And so rather than respond to the town without some investigation into potential uses and needs for the property, I thought that it might make sense for the board to issue a charge to Planning and Building along those lines. Thoughts? Vice Chair Barnes.
I actually tend to disagree for now on that. I'm not saying long term it doesn't have viability, but I think what we always talk about is the fact that we don't really know the material it's on. We've heard speculation that it's ledge and what the viability of working on ledge is, and that's not something that lay people can do. That's the problem that we've had for the last 5 years as we've talked amongst ourselves as lay people. We need an engineering study to know what that property is, and based on what it is, what is appropriate to do with it. And without that, you have lay people speculating amongst themselves, and we're still not moving forward. So I do think we need to know what we're dealing with as far as the property, what what material it is and then what's appropriate to build on it. So without that, it becomes, I think, a bit of a waste of time.
So if the planning and building report were to include an engineering study, would that be something you'd entertain?
Well, I think the engineering study will talk about the materials that are there, what's appropriate for it, and from there we can actually develop a charge with direction. I mean, if they have to integrate within that, then we have to wait for them to come back to us. I think it might be putting the cart before the horse. So not knowing what's appropriate for it, having them do a charge, saying that they have to decide, not decide because we decide, but to develop a plan and a process, that's months and months of their time. And I think first and foremost, having an engineering study up fronted will give us our options, and then we can develop a charge that's more pointed and focused, which will get us more return on our charge because it's going to keep them focused on a task. So, and
I
having
see.
served on planning and building, I think that's the direction that's going to be most efficient to go.
Okay, so I just want to thank you. You clarified for me. You'd like the board to execute an engineering study, and from that, then develop a charge. Thank you, Mr. Schneider.
So I'll take a slightly different point of view, is that having been on the Planning Building Committee for the last 2 years, I'd like to give the Planning and Building Committee something they can sink their teeth into and have them take the lead. We have talked as a board about doing an engineering study to respond to the town on the dispensation of that, but mostly to serve to ourselves that may, I'll say this wrong. We talked about doing an engineering study to support or not support the existence of the tennis court. That's as far as we got. I think an engineering study is likely something that needs to be done to understand just what's there generally. Because there's 3 acres and there's we don't know what's under it. I mean, it's something we've never looked at because when we did and broke the stuff apart, 30 years ago or whenever it was, we did the initial lease.
Probably closer to 40.
Well, 40 years ago. Nobody cared about what was underneath. It was just a place you could do stuff. I'd like to see, I know that the school board essentially is in charge, but I'd like to see this Planning and Building Committee be much more involved, coming to us, asking this stuff, giving them a charge to say, we need you to look at what that land could be used for, knowing that our lease will expire within 2 years, and start looking ahead. I would expect them to structure themselves so that they come to us and say, I'd like approval for an engineering study so that we can get it and start looking at the different options and come to us to do it. I'd like to sort of take an opposite approach. We're still the ones in charge, but I'd really like to see that committee be much more driven, much more to live up to what they do, because I think they've been sort of idling in the background after they did the SAU SPED building and haven't really done a lot. I mean, they've taken sort of our direction and then sort of, responded to it. I'd like them to get more proactive because I think we as a board are going to have other things that we're going to have to deal with, and I'd like them to sort of do what they're doing. That's my particular. I think an engineering study is still on the table for sure, but I'd like them to come to us requesting the engineering study, and then in parallel look to see what the options are, what might be feasible. Let's not lead the witness, so to speak. I'd like them to take their responsibility to do it. So,
Mr. Powell.
I tend to agree with Andy in that I view that committee as being sort of blue sky it. Come up with ideas of what they would like to see or what they feel the district needs, not necessarily dive deep into it, to Shannon's point, because we don't know what's underneath the ground or if it's even viable, but come to us with a series of ideas that could possibly work there and benefit the district, and then decide what the next step is after that. I think that would be a more prudent use of their time, and to Andy's point, give them something to really sink their teeth into, to take charge of, take responsibility, take ownership of. Ownership is the word that I'm looking for. Take ownership of, instead of us dictating to them, this is what we want you to do. Well, put the onus on them and see what they come up with.
Ms. Gualiumi.
So my thoughts are, I mean, to me, it's kind of half dozen one the other. I think we have a resource there, and anything that's going to delay the resource, I think we might as well give them this charge. Time is ticking, and quite frankly, 2 years is not that long of a time. I wouldn't have a problem, bringing this to them and saying exactly, I mean, I'm sure they can see it from watching this meeting right now, that, we were kind of torn. We're suggesting a study. They're smart people. If they're going to look to put something on there, they're going to want to see the engineering study. I have no doubt that they would. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to take an action that will start to move forward on, because that's going to take time. So if it means whether we get the engineering study or whether we agree on it or not, and it delays getting a charge to them, then I don't know. I'm not really supportive of it. I do think it makes sense without delaying to start to move forward with the recommendation of the engineering study.
Yeah. Can I make a suggestion that we request of maybe Business Administrator Chevenel to get quotes for what an engineering study might encompass in tandem, right, with this discussion, right, so that the things can move on a parallel track? Because as I see it, I think there's significant work in terms of going through with building administration and talking about wants or needs in particular before not promising anything, but just knowing what would be the highest use we would have of that property to inform it. If we find in parallel after doing an engineering study that the number 1 and number 3 things on that list won't be supported because of some underlying ledge, well, so be it then, but at least then we've got our prioritized list. So maybe we can structure it in a way that we move both forward, because I agree, it sounds like a long time from now. 2 years is not really that long a time. Mr. Chevenel.
Yeah, thank you. It would be helpful, however, in order to do the engineering study, to know some of the variants that the Planning and Building Committee would be looking at as far as potential use of that site.
Okay.
If it's going to be an administration building, we definitely have to look at the configuration of the site. It's 3 acres, but is it the right 3 acres?
Right.
Is the footprint going to fit? Is it, et cetera? So if I could get some preliminary information, is that something they're considering? That'll drive the study as to what to look for. Obviously, we want to look at subsurface conditions. That's a given, so we do some test borings. But I could put together a packet, but you need to know a little bit more of the scope of what they're looking for. Okay.
Vice Chair Barnes.
And that being said, I think what we also want to look at is that, we want to make sure that the charge is really the O'Gara site and leave it broad enough for them to be able to explore different avenues. So if we find that, an SU building it's not the best site, well, what can we do with the space that we have and not have them come back to us and say, step 1 says it can't be the building, and then delay step 2. So I think we have to have an all-encompassing charge. That being said, I think that especially since we're talking about getting rid of tennis courts, creating green space, et cetera, looking at the space as a whole and saying the way it's been piecemeal developed, because a new idea came and it was put there. So it wasn't that it was designed from the beginning. How can we best utilize the space to maximize the activities and any potential parking? So that way it's not, again, impacting our regular school operations and their infrastructure. So it can be considered, part of the school district, but also distinct and separate for community use at the same time. So, that being said, because it is, it's been used as a community resource for almost 40 years, as we've discussed, and people will look to it, even if it's our management, to be a community resource, at least after hours. So, that being said, I think we just have to keep a flexibility, but without an engineering study being done up front, we're giving them the option to spin their wheels until they know it's viable. So we really need to make sure that as a board that we are not waiting for them to come to us to ask for it, that we're authorizing it up front as we've discussed, and then giving the charge broadly enough that they can explore all options and come back to us with what's best for district operations.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so first, I agree. I mean, the point that I was trying to raise wasn't that we wait for them to come back and request it. I think we need to go with them with the approval to do an engineering study, but then let them try to find what the options are, do the research with the different administrations, at the district as well as the schools, and see. But I think to get to Matt's point, I think we shouldn't pick on one or the other scenario. We know that land, 3.5 acres, could be used for one of multiple things, and it would be good if the engineering study looked at the viability of several generic uses, because if we want to do it up front, we also don't want to wait for them to do the research to help fine-tune the engineering study either. So my personal advice would be to do an engineering study such that we would understand the entire plot in terms of where the ledge is, where it isn't, to see if it's feasible to build a building. If so, where would it need to be located? Can we put fields? Can we put any structures on it? Essentially, let's really scope it out to understand what we can use it for. It might be more money to do it, but if we make it an all-encompassing, then we don't have to do it again. We do it once. And that way that way you then give the Planning and Building Committee, well, you got this chunk of land, you can only use it for A, B, and you can't use it for C and D because of the engineering study's results. So in my mind, we should do it that way.
Okay. It's hard to envision a use that would be more dependent on a solid substructure than a building, right?
Right, but remember that the structure, so if there's ledge like this far underground, I mean, our house sits on ledge. It can't go any further in the ground, which is great. House probably won't move.
Right.
But if I wanted to build a sub-basement, I can't do it in that plan. In the plans for the SAU SPED building, I know had a place to put a vault underneath the ground, in one section of it. So it would be good to understand that, because then if you say, hey, look, it's a great place for a building, but you can't build a basement there, then you don't build a plan for it. So that's why understanding what it's like is the important part.
Understood. Vice Chair Barnes.
And I think on a closing note, the town's not willing to support tennis courts, but the district has shown interest in having tennis courts. So that being said, if it becomes a viable option, we need to know. I think it's very specific that, we've gone on such urban legend on what's viable and what's not without any documented understanding of what is viable or not, because we never could find documentation, and not for lack of trying and looking. So I think even stuff that's been decommissioned should be looked at as whether or not it truly is viable, and if so, we need to plan accordingly based on what the district has already polled and intended as an appropriate use for that land.
Sure. We can certainly use the existing options that are on the property, right, as the going in position as well for the survey, right? I don't know, though, that from a district perspective, if we were to poll all of the buildings and the district, whether, the existing uses of the land as it sits are the ones that would come highest on the list, right? So part of what I'm hoping the board will get from the charge is the district's perspective on what the needs for space are as well. Superintendent.
I was just going to say, to the point that Vice Chair Barnes raises, I think the question that was asked before is, if the tennis courts were reconditioned, would you use them? JMU's, MES, high school. So it was all about do you remember? Yes. That's what we asked. So it wasn't that they came to us and said, we die to have this done. It was, would you use them if we did such and such? So it was kind of a leading question. We didn't start from right. We didn't start from, here's a parcel of land. If you had access to it, what would you like it to be used for? That's different. It was a lead-in. Like, if we do it, will you use it, basically? So, and that's the way it was framed.
Thank you. Ms. Guglielmi.
Well, and I think there's other parts to it too. So, for example, let's say, new SAU office went in that, it opens up another parcel of land closer to
Right.
the high school that maybe that's better suited for parking or tennis court or something else, so.
Yeah, it's great point. Great point. Requires some planning before building. Absolutely. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take all of this discussion and for our next meeting have a draft charge for planning and building. Mr. Powell.
I would like to propose discussion on a second charge, maybe not concurrent, but something for them to begin looking at. Something along the lines of when we charged planning and building some years back with coming up with the naming policy, quote unquote, I'd like planning and building to come up looking into licensing policy, i.e. sponsorship of fields, sponsorships of signs, corporate sponsorship is what I mean by that. Have them look into the viability of it and come up, if it's something that we determine is viable, then have them come up with a policy for it.
So I'm going to perhaps ask a question.
Perhaps.
I'm going to ask a question. I see policy as being this body's responsibility. And so I think...
Maybe I'm using the wrong... I understand what you're saying, and no, that's not what I'm proposing. Maybe do the investigation into the viability of corporate sponsorship, and then let us make the determination if we want to make a policy around it. Is that better?
Perhaps. I think, though, it's probably... in my mind, I would sequence them slightly differently, perhaps. I think if the board wants to entertain the concept of corporate sponsorship for, let's say, an athletic field, then I think the board should probably determine some policy before going out and looking at the viability and perhaps lining up sponsors. For instance, the policy may entail not accepting contributions or donations from companies that are perceived to be not suitable to healthy decision-making by students. Right?
Beer.
We're not going to have the Marlboro cigarette football field, right, as an example. And so before we ask the question, I would think, and again, I'm a short timer here, so it's not going to be mine to resolve, but I would think that the board would want to establish a policy before even going out there in order to drive the way.
And I guess what I was trying to get at is have them do the grunt work of looking into that to determine what's the best way to do it.
I see what you're saying.
But if the consensus is to do that investigating in a different way, that I'm fine with that too.
I see what you're saying. Vice Chair Barnes.
I think we can go a different direction but get the same result that you're looking for, and I think what that is the charge to research what other public schools are doing in that area, including up to and including finding what policies are in place for those who are using sponsorship in their naming. And that way you just give them a research assignment versus a policy assignment, because with that research, we can decide if a policy is appropriate.
That works. I think that's great. And I actually had what is now a third potential charge, and it's related to the high school field indirectly. The plan on the capital, or the project on the capital improvement plan to put a turf field at the high school. The impetus for doing that project was not that the high school field is inadequate in terms of quality. The impetus for doing that project was because there is a rectangular field shortage in town, as documented by the independent committee some few years back that had come up with this. We know this to be the case. We see it with sports at the high school. And the issue with our high school field is that because it's grass, we limit the amount of time, right, that people are on it, right, digging it up so that it's not a mud or a dirt patch. So it's really to solve another problem, which is getting more rectangular field usage. And one of the things that occurred to me is that we have a couple of properties in the district-owned properties, bought years ago with plans, for building out schools if the town ever got to a size where we would need them, that might be suitable for fields, maybe grass fields. The high school field, and part of the reason I think you're looking at the feasibility of securing corporate sponsorship is it's an expensive endeavor. The field is roughly $1 million to put in. They have a life of about 10 to 15 years before you need to replace them. And so it's a long-term commitment for a school board to say we're going to support this type of a field. And so, there are two properties that stand out. There's the Babusick Lake Road property, 277. It's right at the bend where it goes to South Babusick and then veers off to head up to Camp Road. There's a carve out there. There's 40 acres, the 40-acre woods back there that we had a forest maintenance project some years ago that I think generated about $75,000 or something.
It's around $35,000.
I forget.
It's the Timmins site you're referring to.
I did not know the original name. So there's 40 acres of property back there, maybe less suitable, but perhaps something that should be looked at as well as the Continental Boulevard property, which is just under 13 acres. I don't know whether it's suitable for fields or not. It has already been promised as contingent on a warrant article with the South Fire Station as being the property where we would transfer that property over to the town to house the fire station. And as we know, it's also in the proposed Kinder Morgan route. And so I guess my point was, does the board think it's feasible or desirable to have planning and building look at the feasibility of using one of these or both of these properties for the creation of rectangular fields in town? Ms. Guagliumi.
I think that's an outstanding suggestion. I think it's a great suggestion. Obviously, we know that we've been looking at turf for a while, been talking about it. There's also a lot of safety concerns about it, so it'd be great to get some research as far as the pros and cons. And then as well as looking at other district property, I think that makes sense. I think that's a really good idea.
Great. Mr. Schneider.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it'd be another thing to obviously relook at the turf, what the latest is. I mean, we haven't looked at it for a couple of years, but looking at the other properties is important. I think I was driving down Continental today, actually, thinking about because you had mentioned that was an idea. What's interesting is the area behind Thornton's Ferry School. It's partially a swamp area, but it's relatively flat compared to the other side of the road where the thing would go. So I would like them to get real creative about any available land that maybe even if a building's sitting on it today, what's available to us in the district. Because I think many times we as a board, we'll get a lot of change. We don't realize where all the land is that we own. And it would be good at a minimum to do an inventory and remind the public as well as the board where all the different district-owned properties are and what their possible uses are, with a focus on the fields, but just to understand where they are. I think that would be a real good activity.
Okay, good. Any other feedback? Ms. Gualiun?
And I think it's also a good activity to do as we look at what to do with that O'Gara property. You know, whether some of those activities or stations, you know, could be resituated as far as an overall strategy. So I think that the timing makes sense for them to look at it all together.
Great. So we've got 3 potential charges to have planning and building look at. So we'll draft some draft charges for the board's consideration and movement at the April 4th meeting. Anything else on this? No? Thank you. Good discussion. And that will take us to item number 8, Board's response to the proposed voter information guide. Superintendent Chaffrey and Business Administrator Chevino.
So I'm going to start out, and then I'm going to ask Matt to join in because we've been conferring about this. So I want to just highlight the documents that were in your packet. You have the summary of warrant articles that's on 8x10, this sheet that Matt has formulated relative to our 7 warrant articles. You have what is known as the Voter's Guide to the 2016 official ballot. This was prepared by the town, and when we asked for it, we were specifically wanting to know how they prepared their material, but more importantly, it had been said that a sample ballot was also a part of their material, and we wanted to see how they did that. If you look, you'll see that there appears to be on the back space, perhaps a space for it, but what we've learned is it really gets folded over like this, and the ballot gets inserted inside. And lastly, we gave you what we call the pamphlet form that we have put together. So I just want to talk to you about just a couple of facts about these, with the idea that tonight we'd gather your input, and we almost have, if you will, short-term possibilities and long-term possibilities, because we have a very short window in which to get the material prepared for our public. We need to issue it on Monday, April 4th. So I think we have this year's information, and then we can look forward to what might be for next year. So I've talked to you about the difference. You have this document that gets folded over with an inserted ballot up against what we call our pamphlet form. There's a difference in pricing. We understand that the town's information costs about $3,500, and ours costs $1,573. So there's a little bit difference in cost. We have used this pamphlet method for 13 years. In fact, Matt and I were kind of conferring about how long have we done this. And I think our approach was one perhaps to, I don't want to say make it simple, but we wanted something that someone would be willing to take into the booth. And I really don't think we thought that we could duplicate the ballot, to be honest. I think we were of a mind, all right, if we have kind of a checklist of what of all the articles, that would be appropriate. So we've gained some information too. But we put all this before you so that you can help us determine what do you think makes sense perhaps for this year, 2016, and then what would you offer up for 2017? Because I see them perhaps being a bit different simply because of the time frame. Matt, go further.
Yeah, there is a couple more differences in the two approaches. If we go with the regular pamphlet version, which has just the checklist on the back and doesn't have the ballot, we do that printing in-house, so we can control that and we can just get it done. If we have to do the ballot as an insert, that's something we can't do in-house, so we'd have to go to a printer to do that and to fold, staple, and do the bulk mailing for us. So it's someone we'd have to shop that out too.
Do you have a sense of what the cost of doing that would be?
I have not contacted them. I know who I would go to. They're right in town here anyway.
Yeah.
But I haven't presented it to them yet.
Great. Discussion. Mr. Schneider had his hand up, and then Mr. Powell, and then Vice Chair Barnes.
So I know that I'm one of the ones that has been poking at this issue a little bit, in particular the sample ballot. My concern with the whether you go with the pamphlet or the fold is that you've got a summary of the warrant article, but you don't have a wording of the warrant article. So that's why I felt that just by including a sample ballot somewhere would allow people to see what the ballot looked like. It allow them to see how the voting is out there, and then what the warrant articles look like. And then it makes a little more sense if you go to the article summaries, because then they can sort of say, oh, okay, this is what it means, how is it worded, because I don't know about others, but when I walk in, I can't remember what number article, even though I'm up there moving them forward at the deliberative session, I can't remember which number is what and things like that. So that was one of my reasons to sort of push the sample ballot. So that's short term. I'd like to see a way we include the sample ballot along with the information we do here. The other thing is that, you know, when you put our sample next to what the town does, the town's is much more in-depth, gives a lot more detail about all the different funding aspects and things like that. And there is validity to that because we get asked, at least I do, about the details behind the budget that we've approved, what the items are, what the balance sheet is. You know, can I look and see what it is? You know, what are we spending on infrastructure, things like that. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to put it on a voter's guide, but it would be nice if maybe if there was a place on the district website where some of this could exist, and then you put an easy-to-find URL on the voter's guide. It would at least help them to look, because not everybody knows where to go to the school ballot. Now, how far we can go this year, the summaries and stuff is a question, but I think, you know, our budget represents over 2 times what the town's is, and I think getting more detail out just so people know is important to do. That's my opinion.
Okay, Mr. Powell?
Excuse me, I agree with providing the greater detail, specifically because our budget is the biggest in town. However, I don't support creating a document like this just for the sake of doing that. What I support is the same type of pamphlet information with a URL link, but more specifically maybe a QR code so that somebody could snap a picture of it and go to it right away with their smartphone. Because we all know how user-friendly our URL address is, and people tend to forget how to spell it. I would rather go with the less expensive version, but have the information available for someone to research on the web or on the district website. Does that make sense?
If I could add, the sample ballot is online right now. In fact, the entire budget is online. So any detail you wanted to look, it's
Absolutely.
It's all there.
But something like this going out in the mail to direct people to that,
direct them to that
probably
specific
is not a
area on
bad
the web
idea.
page would, like you said, the QR code, which is all the rage now. That,
Exactly.
You know, you can just blip it on your phone or your device, and it just takes you directly there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I think that is probably the more fiscally responsible way to do that.
Vice Chair Barnes?
And I think we need to stop doing this altogether, but I'm not saying we should stop informing our voters. And what I'm saying is that, you know, we've always had that era of school district and town having 2 distinctly separate events for voting, but they're the same time. So collaborating with the town to have a comprehensive, they're going to the same place for the same reason to do the same thing. Why aren't we collaborating to put a comprehensive guide together? And maybe it is simple on our side, but directs them to our website to get fine detail, which I think is great, because I think we can offer a lot more than the voter's guide. You know, but maybe even collaborate with the town councils to have a shared vision and a consistent way of communicating, so that way people don't feel they're navigating 2 seas for the same tax dollars. Mm-hmm. So for that, I'd like to see more cohesion in the way we're doing it. And that's been something I've heard as well. Collaboration, cooperation, and cohesion. And co-branding, why not?
Ms. Guglielmi?
Just echoing a couple comments, I 100% agree with Davis. I mean, I like that this goes out, that it's less expensive, and I think that the more information, I often feel that we don't have enough information on the district website. And I think the more people, stakeholders, get used to going to the district website, and the more, and it looks good. There's some of the things that we put out there lately are really easily accessible, and the more we have that, that's great. The QR code is exactly what I was thinking of too. Not everyone knows what they do or is familiar with using them, but for those that do, it makes it easy and more convenient. And then to Shannon's point, I think I guess I'd like to maybe put something actionable out there, because we have enough time now when we think of the next year. And, and I don't know if it makes sense for Marge to reach out to the town manager and find, what's the first next step, I guess, is the question I'm asking. And whether I know we had our group meetings, but I think it's worth a conversation for our superintendent to have with the town manager to come up with a couple of options. And she could go back to the town councilors as well and see what we could come up with. Because at the end of the day, it's confusing, I think, for the taxpayers. I think it's frustrating because, they know that they're paying really for this mailing to go out twice, and it's not convenient for them. They're going to the election on the same day, and now they've got two different voters' guides that they have to try to match up. And so I think that this is one instance where we need to have some joint communication, like Shannon had said, and save some money by consolidating the information that the voters need from us and from the town.
Cindy, I'm glad you agree with me.
Must be an inside joke. So I hope that what you've gotten is good short-term and potential longer-term feedback. To summarize, I think what I've heard is the pamphlet in the short term, the pamphlet with links to sample ballots, budget data, et cetera, or a QR code that will get you there, or both, right, will provide the short-term solution. And then longer-term, we've heard about the perhaps combined mailing. Maybe that also gets us efficiencies in cost, besides having a potential benefit to the voters. I guess it's interesting, right? The superintendent mentioned the voters' guide, and the fact that this year's voters' guide is the same as last year's and the one 13 years before. I think we had evidence earlier in the evening of something that we haven't done the way that we've done it in the past. There was a time there was no parental input sought on the school calendar. We introduced the concept of getting parental input, and with this cycle have found the most effective way of getting parental input on it, and have found that data to be extremely helpful in decision making. And I guess I would classify this in much the same way, right? We've been doing something a certain way, but there's room for improvement, and we can certainly look to the future. So I think for those longer term steps, I will certainly look on from the sidelines and wish you luck in that endeavor. But certainly for the short term, I think people will find it helpful to have access to more detail. So thank you. And that will take us now to item number 9, request to change the title of the business administrator. Superintendent Jaffrey.
Thank you. So this is the time of year for me to do performance reviews of principals, directors, and central office administrators. And so based on my observation of Matt Chevenel's work for 16 years, believe it or not, 1 year with Superintendent O'Neill and 15 years with me, and his pursuit of further academic educational attainment, I am going to propose that we change his title from Business Administrator to Assistant Superintendent of Finance. And as I go about making this request, I'm not asking for any additional compensation for him. It is the change of title. I want to highlight some projects, and it really is a sample of the things that I have seen Matt do over time, and in many cases, I would call it an extension beyond what a business administrator does. I go back to overseeing the building of Merrimack Middle School. That was just a Herculean effort that was done in a year's time, and I'm sure he would tell you that many people participated in the effort, and yet he was the overseer of the project. And at the same time that was going on, he was a major partner with me in the reorganization of the school district. And it's interesting, again, if you go back and look at that, it was, again, a Herculean task because we created a new middle school for grades 7 and 8. We took the former Mastrocola Middle School and turned it into an upper elementary of 5 and 6. We took 3 elementary schools that were readiness through 5th grade and turned them into K through 4. So if you even think of the movement that went on to have it all straightened out with a whole lot of upset, I think it's now when I go back and review the past that I realize what a significant event that was. And most persons, superintendents and other central office personnel, never get to build a new school, much less reorganize the district and have it happen with what I would say was minimum hassle. He has also overseen projects that have to do with security, developing secure entrances really for the 4 elementary schools and reorganizing the office area at James Mastrocola Upper Elementary School. And again, I would hope you as a board who have observed his work over a period of time realizes when these projects happen, they do just happen. There's not a lot of upset, and I feel like when I'm saying this, I'm going to jinx us, but it just is something that really, again, it's when you begin to look at it over time, you realize its importance. He reconfigured the parking lot at area at Reeds Ferry Elementary School, and again, what a significant difference that has made for parents and children and staff there. He was the overseer of our conversion from oil to natural gas. And again, anytime you go through a project, you discover other kinds of things going on. And again, it was seamlessly done, and the objective was accomplished in a very short period of time. One of the things that I so admire about Matt is technology integration, and we talked just a few minutes ago about doing things better and more efficiently than we've done in the past. I would say it's his professional and personal goal to have us be a paperless office. He hasn't put date to it. That's very wise, so he won't be disappointed. But the fact of the matter is I look at the software that's being used and the collaboration that goes on between the network administrator and our systems manager and Nancy Rose. And again, we are making a lot of gains in a very short period of time. You all have spoken about wanting online registration, and he really is the one who is overseeing that effort. So I would say we are coming faster into the 21st century because of Matt. He is a very successful negotiator. Our transportation contract, when we went from one provider to another, and again, got what I would call a better contract. This saves us money, and that's what it's all about, as well as being a partner in labor contracts over 16 years. He has worked with every single team, both for the support staff and the Teachers Association. Again, I don't take that lightly. It's a lot of time, and he has been able to work with all sorts of board members and our HR director in completing that work. He will complete his master's degree in education from Southern New Hampshire University this year. He has been committed to it and has done an exemplary job in the attainment of this coursework. And he oversees the district when Mark and I aren't here. He is the third in line to oversee the district, and that happens very frequently. I spoke to you about the title change last April when I came before you and said I wanted it to happen in this period. I felt that tonight was an appropriate night to put it before you to be able to answer any questions you have, and I would hope that you would find your way to put the title change on the consent agenda for April 4th. And that would give you proper time to think about it, and if you needed it to be pulled as a separate agenda item, I would welcome that too. But I would like it to happen in this time period. So,
Any question or comment? Mr. Powell.
This is absolutely not something that any of us take lightly. I, for one, appreciate the hard work that Matthew is. It's hard speaking of him like he's not here, and that Matt has done. I had the fortune of working with him in two different times of my board career, and you mentioned the building of the middle school and getting all that accomplished, and then the recent projects as well. I'm sure you have done numerous hours of research on coming up with the right title, but I'm wondering if Assistant Superintendent of Finance doesn't capture everything that he does, in the fact that he is the chief negotiator. Truly, to me, he is an administrator of the district, and I don't know how everyone else feels, but I just don't know if the word finance captures everything that's involved in that job. That's the only comment that I have to make about it.
I would go back and tell you two things. One, I dealt with the Department of Ed to just make sure that it is a local board's decision as to how the position is named, and I reverted back again to history. Sometimes history serves us well, and we have had in our past assistant superintendents of finance. The assistant superintendency that Mark holds is one of curriculum, and if you look at our letterhead, it says such. And prior to this, Dennis Pope was the assistant superintendent of finance. John Linzell was. And when Scott Isabel first came to us, he was a business administrator who became an assistant superintendent of finance. So I think I reverted. I had the opportunity to serve with all of them, and so this is a title that I felt was appropriate. But I'm happy to entertain other possibilities. But that's how we came to it.
Vice Chair Barnes.
I know she talked about credentials and, meaning what the DOE would call standards to hold the title type thing. Are there defined titles established by the DOE, or do we have the flexibility of calling, like if we decided it should be the Assistant Superintendent of Business Affairs, would that have a definition in Concord that would be understood and I guess worked with?
I would say I would want to confer with someone at the DOE to make sure, because I don't believe that particular title is one that's been held. So even though it very much is a local board's decision, I think it stays within a tight frame. So, I would say that the generic assistant superintendent would be important, and then I'll check, how far the bound goes here.
Yeah, I think what's important for Matt in his career development in his place in the state is that he has something where he can look to find peers. It's like, saying, I have a dog, but do I have a Labradoodle? Do I have what I would call a very specific dog that has very specific traits? So that being said, I want to make sure that it gives him what I would call an audience of peers based on his title as well. So I think that might be important to him.
Any other question, comment? Mr. Schneider. I had made a mental note and forgot.
It's that lame duck thing going on there.
Yeah,
right?
maybe.
Yeah, it was. So having worked on the budget committee for many years and then the school board, it's obvious that the three of you are the ones that the boards turn to, the various boards turn to, and committees for the operations of the district. So I have no problem at all with Matt being, from a title perspective, sort of at the equivalence of what Mark does for curriculum, only Matt for his role, especially, having done with Matt on many of the things that you just described in terms of what he is. But I agree with Shannon that we need to make sure the title is proper and something that can be related outside the district, because you've given examples, Marge, where we've used assistant superintendent of finance before, which is good, and so I don't have a problem with that precedent, but it'd be good to look around just to see what other behaviors are there, because I'd like us to be doing it in a consistent way, either with ourselves, which you've built the case for, or with the other districts on what they kind of do. So, I know his role is more than finance, so if finance is the right name, I don't have any problem with it, but let's just make sure the diligence is done inside and outside the district.
Mr. Marcus.
I had one question for the superintendent, and that was the previous assistant superintendents for finance. Did they have the same scope of responsibilities that Mr. Chevenel does? Because I believe that if they did, then keeping the same title would be the most effective way to make him relatable among his peers. But then, because the purpose of the new title is to encapsulate everything he does, if those previous superintendents of finance didn't have all the same responsibilities that Mr. Chevenel does now, then we should find a new title. So do they have the same responsibilities?
So what I would say is none of his predecessors ever built a school. I would say none of his predecessors, to the extent that he has, worked with technology, because if you think about it, 16 years ago, we were in a different place. So the fact of the matter is the position, like all of our positions, continues to evolve, They're not static, and so you embrace what comes to you, and it just morphs into different things. A more generic term to what I believe Shannon was offering is assistant superintendent of business. That's all-encompassing as compared to saying finance. Basically, anything that he does has to do with some business principle and so on. I see where you're going without question. Mm-hmm.
Ms. Guglielmi, and then Mr. Marcus, you had your hand up again.
Well, along the same line, something, might be appropriate to be Vice President of Finance and Business Administration. I'm sorry. Too much corporate world for me, I think. Assistant Superintendent of Finance and District Administration or something, or Business Administration.
What I do want to suggest is that we keep it a little bit simple, only to have it on letterhead. So in other words, technically I could say that Mark oversees curriculum instruction and assessment. Yeah. So we say CI, but on the letterhead it's Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum. And so, believe it or not, we still use letterhead. So, yeah.
Well, I think what you're hearing, at least for me, is that an acknowledgement of what Matt does. And I know that I've worked with him for, 5 years, and he's thought of very highly by me. I know this board, and certainly people will frequently tell me, say good things about Matt to me, whether it's someone who needed information from him or this and that. He always does it quickly and with a smile, and he's just got a lot on his plate, and I appreciate everything he does. So I think really that's what you're hearing, is that, we're trying to make it right.
Yeah. Mr. Marcus, you had your hand up again?
Yeah, Ms. Guagliumi mentioned some of the things that I was going to say, so to beat the dead horse as minimally as possible, as I would just say, after hearing the answer to your question, because I think Mr. Chevenel has outgrown not only the title of business administrator, but also that of assistant superintendent of finance. So I agree with the assistant superintendent part, and I would concur with the other board members that we should think of another word to follow rather than finance.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus. I'm happy to hear the board in concurrence on the aspect. There's no question that everyone views the role, the responsibilities that Mr. Chevenel undertakes to be beyond business administrator and to be broad enough to carry the title of assistant superintendent. Right, what we're all struggling to do is encapsulate, we've used business administration, I think of the role as really the operational aspects of the district, right, which encompasses technology, the logistics of those transportation, not just the contracts, but the daily transportation of students to and from school, everything that keeps, the district operating, right? So, as you do your research in terms of appropriate titles, whether it's Assistant Superintendent of Finance, Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations, Assistant Superintendent Business Administration, I think that what's clear is, I heard resoundingly, everyone sees the scope of the role as being an assistant superintendent's role. So we'll look forward to hearing what you see out there. And thank you, Mr. Chevenel, for a job well done, not just this year, but all those past years. And that will take us then to item number 10, other correspondence. Vice Chair Barnes.
I received an email from a constituent that because we didn't have minutes up yet, and they could not find us online our last meeting, they wanted to know when our graduation was, and it wasn't on our website before today. So I called our assistant superintendent of whatever he'll be someday, and he actually put it on our website, and it will be in the Power School Daily memo as well. So thank you, Matt, for getting that done so quickly. And I think Mark also wants a title change now as Assistant Superintendent of CIA, because it sounds really cool. Sounds very covert.
Any other correspondence? Ms. Guglielmi.
I received a couple pieces of correspondence regarding the school calendar and appreciation for the survey. I also received a piece of correspondence regarding the way we had asked the questions, that a survey could be asked in a certain way that would allow all sorts of gradients of responses. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. And I received a piece of correspondence I shared with the board related to a personnel issue. And that will close correspondence. Comments? Any comments? Mr. Marcus.
I had wanted to comment on item number 4 with Mrs. Crook's retirement. And I just wanted to, I didn't get a chance to say it earlier, but as a student, I wanted to express my sincerest gratitude to Mrs. Crook. She was my AP Economics teacher, and she was also the advisor for the National Economics Summit last year. And she is one of my favorite teachers in the school and one of the favorites of many, many other students. Her homeroom is known throughout our class as probably the best homeroom, if not among our class in the school. She always makes an effort. Every morning, she's one of the first people at the school, and she always gets boiling water and fills up thermos things so her students can have hot chocolate if they'd like before the class. And then she washes all the mugs we use. And her commitment, obviously, I think she's been teaching, what was it, 19 years?
43 years.
Oh. Oh, wow. Then even longer than I thought, and I have only known her for 4 of them. But just from that small fragment, 9% of her teaching career, I wanted to express on the public record that I'm thankful for everything she's done and that she is an awesome teacher.
Thank you. That is much appreciated. And that will take us to item number 11, new business. Superintendent.
So I need to have a session with the board for staff welfare to do reviews of the very positions that I named earlier, and I want to put out a couple of dates. The first date I would offer you is Monday, April 11th. I chose that date because you're used to meeting on Mondays. So would I be able to have the 5 of you on that date? Because that's my first preference.
Calendars are being checked.
Okay. We can meet as early as you can. If you could meet at 6 o'clock, that would be great. If that's too difficult, 6:30.
I'm good.
Everybody's good on that date? Okay. Do you want 6:30 or 6? What's your preference?
Hold on, folks
Oh.
are still checking.
I'm sorry.
I'm good.
6?
Good.
6 is good? 6, and I'll, place to be determined, I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other new business? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to item 12, committee reports. Vice Chair Barnes.
I have 2.5. We'll start with Greater Woods. I did miss the meeting that we had last Tuesday to attend the district celebration of song, which was a beautiful event, as it always is. We have some great talent in this district in the area of vocal, and actually there's even trumpet and cello accompaniment and some piano accompaniment as well from some students, but great work. That being said, I will pass this around. It's the only color copy I had because I was running late. But we erected the bridge that we talked about a few months ago that we funded. So I want to show you the finished work. It's the one that's coming out of the area that would serve residents of the Marty Drive area where our students do come through the woods during the day. This was taken yesterday because it was built yesterday, and then we got 5 inches of snow, so it probably looks different right now. But that being said, it traverses about 20 feet, and I'll let the district have a copy of this. Have this copy, actually. So that will help to basically keep people out of the wetlands. We actually did some trail work to avoid ATVs coming through wetlands as they were. So I think it will serve our students well. I think it also gives a nice opportunity for some good areas for our students in the middle school and any other school that comes out hiking to find some good woodland creatures, because there's some nice lines of sight from where that trail serves. So I think it'll be great. A couple of mallards stopped by to see what we were doing. It was great. And last Wednesday, we had the New Hampshire School Boards Association Board of Directors meeting where we took not only a retirement but a resignation. To serve on the board, you have to be active in your district, and one member did not get reelected, which required a resignation. So we will be looking for some new blood on the board. But we also met, the highlight of the meeting was meeting with our congressional delegation, representatives that specialize in education for both Senators Ayotte and Shaheen, and Congresswoman Custer and Congressman Ginta. He doesn't have an education expert, so he sent his Veterans Affairs person to send a representative. But before doing so, like I did last year, I met with the superintendent because it's far be it for me to understand what goes into the federal guidelines impacting a day-to-day operation of public education. So I provide these notes to the constituents. I will provide you copies, so you have basically what we shared. And then there was a roundtable. I think I'm the one that actually put it in writing, so they didn't have to take too many notes. And on your side. So we talked about ESSA, which is the Every Student Succeed Act, which is, of course, all the rage these days. We talked about Title I, II, and III funding. So we talked about the things that are day-to-day with us, our food service program, and the structure and how it doesn't provide us flexibility. It's a requirement versus a guideline. The waste that comes into it and the cost that comes into waste. And honestly, that was a shared theme amongst every member of the board. So we were all talking about even the most impoverished schools are dealing with high waste issues, whether the kids aren't eating it or whether you'll see some of the guidelines so you can get 2 ounces of protein. Well, when you're 16 years old and 6'3", 2 ounces of protein is not going to get you filled up. So those are things that we shared with them. Things that were, I think, enlightening to me was what other districts shared with them. And it's not funny. It's the furthest thing from funny, but where we're talking about funding, they're talking about the impact of mental health. And that was an overriding theme amongst lesser populous areas. Somersworth obviously has a lower income demographic. You have, the North Country, White Mountains area. And they're talking about, and even Portsmouth, they're talking about mental health in students. And it's not just what we're exploring, with students and anxiety, and we've talked about that quite a bit as a board, but they're talking about students who are the responsible parties in their families because their parents are the ones addicted to the drugs. And that they're having drug and alcohol counselors that are getting funded through grants to help students navigate day-to-day living, through school, because when they go home, it's nothing but dysfunction. And it was not one, not two, but 3 different districts that talked about that. And they go from, Portsmouth to the North Country. It was a shared concern. So where we didn't discuss it, I found that it's a hauntingly prevalent topic in other districts. How are they going to get through it? So there are grants that they are getting access to for mental health counselors that specialize in living in addictive environments. So that was shocking to us. So other than that, it was business as usual, and we also had a guest from UNH talking about the research they do in the area of public education, and they will be coming back on, we hope, a regular basis to talk about some of the research they're doing and how it could provide resources for us at the district level in areas of policy especially.
Thank you. This is great. Mr. Marcus.
I had 5 committee reports, but 3 of them have since been spoken of already. I was going to mention the basketball game, and then the celebration of song, and the theater one acts. But the 2 that are left, the MHS concert band this past Friday went to the New Hampshire Music Educators Association Large Group Festival up at Bow High School, where we played the program we've been working on since December, and for one of the songs even before that. And we received an A rating overall, as well as straight A's on all of the subcategories. And then finally, there was, I'm not sure how much the board is familiar with this. I know that the superintendent and Dr. McLaughlin are, but a student at MHS, Matt Spatel, he invented, it's called the ChemiCube, which is a science education device, which measures chemicals out to 1/4,500th of a milliliter with that level of precision, and that level can only be achieved otherwise. He invented something that does that, and that level of precision can only be achieved using medical technology, which costs thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, and he can produce his ChemiCube for, I believe, $300. And he and his lab partner in AP Chemistry, Sarah Mason, they went to a New England regional competition where they presented the ChemiCube, and they placed 2nd overall and 1st place in the engineering category, and they will be going to Phoenix, Arizona to compete on the international level.
Wow. That's awesome. Patented, that's right. Any other committee reports? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move to item 13, public comments on agenda items. Seeing none, we will close public comments, take a moment to sign the manifest, and I will entertain a motion to adjourn, made by Vice Chair Barnes, seconded by Ms. Gualiumi. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? None. That carries 5-0-0. And Mr. Marcus
In favor.
is in favor. Thank you, everyone. Good night.